And welcome to the continuation of this examination of ISO 9001. Now we've got up to this point where we have to examine the requirements for product realization. Now this probably is the main focus for most people, because obviously this is what they're in business for, is to actually make something, either a product or a service, to sell. So this is the main part of it. And the quality management system does impose requirements on that. Starting with, there must be planning for product realization. This strange as it may seem, it just nobody would think about it. But the quality management system demands that the product realization, that is its design and development and everything to do with getting it to the customer, be considered, the resources required for it be made available, the processes for its design and development be established and maintained, and that the verification and validation procedures that are going to be used during its production and delivery are determined. And the last thing in the planning is to determine what records need to be kept to prove that the product realization has conformed to the requirements of the quality management system. So it's no good. Essentially, it says that you can't have a product realization system, a procedures manual that simply sits on the shelf. It has to be relevant and live, and you have to prove that you've conformed to it. Now, I'm very aware that in a lot of ISO 9001 audits, there's an awful lot of work done to essentially gather the data to show that yes, you conform to this, when in fact there's nothing of the sort. The intention, though, is that the organization must do its best to specify the processes as performed and make available the resources to do all that. So that's the planning for product realization. Now we come to the customer-related processes. Now these are obviously, you might think, are pretty easy. You got to get the requirements from the customer. Well, that's true. You have to find out what the customer wants. Now, if there is a customer that you can get to, now a product that's built for a general market, it's pretty hard to go and get a customer to give them your requirements. The general intention of this clause, though, is that the requirements for the product are determined before you build the product. Okay, so you do some planning first. Now, it's not only the requirements of the customer. If you look at a lot of obligations about customer liability, and I think it's contract law, certainly if you talk to the commercial office holder in any production organization, you'll find that it's not only the customer requirements that you must abide by. There are the stated customer requirements and the implied customer requirements, and the requirements that would normally be expected in the industry, even if the customer didn't think of them and didn't imply them. Then there are regulatory requirements, as well as requirements of your own organization. So there are several sources of requirements. Now, to give you an example of what this is, a customer may specify something for a product that's likely to be used in an environment of requiring safety. Now, quite possibly, the customer didn't think to specify safety, and you suddenly, knowing your contractual obligations, put in some requirements there for safety. And these obviously are going to cost something, and presumably you're going to charge the customer. Well, the customer might not want to pay for it. Well, now we've got a problem, because the regulatory requirements do require that you put in those requirements to consider the safety, and basically the customer to wear it. So these are some of the obligations to do with determining the requirements. Let's say you've got the requirements. Now there is an obligation on the part of the organization, that's you, to review those requirements. Now, presumably you also have to produce evidence that you reviewed those requirements. It can't be simply, oh yeah, we've got all these requirements, and without even reviewing it all, that is the organization reviewing those requirements and all its implications on its design and development of the product. That has to be done, that has to be agreed. The organization has to satisfy itself that yes, it can produce this thing, whether it's a product or a service. But that's the whole purpose of the review of the customer requirements. The only other requirement within ISO 9001 concerning the customer is that you must maintain communications with the customer over pretty much anything. That's communications over the requirements, communications over the progress, communications over the status of the product during its development, and generally there's an obligation to keep the communications open for any disputes and disagreements that may arise. Communication is quite a big deal. Okay, so we've got that. We've got we've planned out the production system. We've got the customer requirements, and the next thing we need to do is to design and develop the product. Now that just goes through a fairly standard series of things. There's the planning of it, based on the requirements, whether they're yours or the customers. But the whole design and development must be planned. You have to consider the inputs that you're coming in, and whether those inputs are, in the case of software development, basically not much other than the requirements. But you have to also consider the outputs. So the output may well be obviously a software system, but does it include an obligation to produce the test specification, the test results, the documentation, the user manual, anything required to install the system, to maintain the system, to operate the system. All of these are potential outputs of the design and development phase. And so they would normally be considered and become part of the design and development. There is an obligation to review the design and development. Now, ISO 9001 can't of itself determine or legislate where and how the product is reviewed during its development. All it can say is that you have to do some sort of review. At least at the end, you must do some sort of review. Some of the things that you must do, so a couple of clauses in this particular section of ISO 9001, is you must consider the means of verification and the means of validation. Now, verification is determining that the product was developed the way the organization intended it to be developed. So if there are particular practices that are supposed to be followed, this is verification that those practices have been followed. The colloquial expression for it is to build the thing right. That is, to use the right methods, the right practices, the right tools to build the product. Validation is to determine that you built the right product. So validation is determining that, insofar as you can tell, or not so far as you can tell, hopefully you've done better than that, but determining whether the product meets the customer requirements, or meets the customer and everyone else meets its requirements. Now that can be done. Verification and validation frequently is broken down. Verification frequently done at each process. So, for example, if you're doing a software architecture process or high-level design, call it what you will, there's normally some verification that the method with which this organization wants to do its software architecture has been followed, and that if architect was to produce UML diagrams and that there be some sort of review of these things. Did that happen? Did it produce a UML diagram? Was there a review of it all? So that's the verification of it all. Now the validation would normally be a check that the architecture implements, or the architecture provides the means to implement the requirements. So it's a cross process, it's not within a process. So you have the verification and validation. And the last thing that in this particular clause of ISO 9001 is that you have to have some sort of control over changes to the product as it's going through. This is fairly standard practice now, but as surprised as it may seem, there are some organizations that don't control the changes, either changes to the requirements that are just there's informal changes to the requirements, particularly within software development. And this is actually quite a big problem within software development. Now, 9001 does not prevent changes to the requirements. It merely says you have to control them. So it has to be recorded that it was changed, and the consequences of that change be traced all the way through the development cycle. So there you are. That's the design and development clause of ISO 9001. This is clause 7. The next section of ISO 9001 is purchasing, and this could be purchasing for the raw materials to go into your production system, or it could be purchasing of equipment or tools or utilities, any sort of infrastructure that becomes part of the production process. The obligations are, the requirements of 9001 are to ensure that what you get is what you wanted. So there is an obligation to check and to record that what you've received was what you specified to be purchased. So that's the overall requirement. That breaks down into recording an obligation to record information about what was required, what was bought, what was received, and information about how you verified that what you got was what you wanted. Now, that might not sound like much, but consider in this day of outsourced development, you've actually purchased something from somebody. How are you going to prove that what you bought, that outsourced software development, is what you specified? So you have some obligation there in the way of testing. That comes under a different part of ISO 9001. After the section on purchasing, there is a section on production and service provision. So having built the product, if it is a mass-produced product or a bulk-produced product, having designed and developed it, now you're going to build many of them. Okay, well, we're dealing with that part. That is the reproduction of the production aspect of it all. And if it is a case of you built something and you're providing a service, this particular clause, is clause 7.5, deals with that service provision. So the first thing there is the requirement to control production and service provision. Now that comes down to an accurate description of what the product or service is, work instructions that might be necessary, suitable equipment, available of monitoring and measuring equipment, implementation of that monitoring and measuring equipment, and implementation of post-release delivery and post-delivery instructions. So this is kind of all. These are the things that you normally would provide in either a production or a service delivery environment. The next thing you have to do is to provide validation of the processes of production or service provision. So not only do you have to provide the processes for that production or process for service delivery, you have to produce evidence that it is what you intended it to be. The next requirement is for identification and traceability. I guess the place where this is most visible is in product recalls. How do you know which customer got which product? Well, if you're just selling a general software product over the web and people download it and install it, you don't have much control. If, however, it's something like pharmaceuticals, then you've got a whole other different obligation there. You have to keep track of your batches and determine where they went. In other manufacturers, such as car manufacturer with product recalls, there's, I think it depends mostly on public announcements. With software, though, particularly in this day and age of multiple releases and very frequent releases, particularly patch releases and incremental releases, then you have some obligation to keep track of which, exactly what went into which release. If you are supplying to a small number of customers, you have some obligation to keep track of who got exactly which product at what time. Customer property. If you receive some property from the customer, in case of software development, this could be data. It could be possibly an example system to allow you to test on an interface or something like that. But anyway, whatever it is, if you've received it from the customer, you are obliged to look after it, to store it appropriately, to deal with any requirements that would be appropriate. Now, one of the ones that possibly would be appropriate in software, particularly if you're looking after data, is security and confidentiality. Now, ISO 9001 does not require you to do that because it can't. It can't say that everybody must look after security and confidentiality because it's not always relevant. But the obligation is to determine how customer property must be looked after and to do that, to develop that. One of the more interesting clauses in ISO 9001 to do with software development is the control of monitoring and measuring equipment. Now, this used to drive auditors nuts because they'd be looking around for something that in software measured anything, and of course, for the most part, it doesn't. And they'd be trying to find out, well, what was it they could measure? What was it that was an integral part of it all? And I was part of an audit. I was the client side of the audit. When an auditor, the only thing they could find were the anti-static straps that were used in our labs by the engineers. Now, it happened that this lab was a closed lab, so the equipment came into the lab and it was used. The engineers, of course, hacked it around a fair bit, did all manner of things to it, but it was lab equipment. I mean, if somebody wandered up with their anti-static mats on the floor, but if we didn't worry too much about anti-static stuff. We had anti-static mats, we had anti-static chairs, we had anti-static benches, we had anti-static all over the place. Nevertheless, there was a technical requirement for anti-static straps, and these had to be checked every month or so. And there was a log on the wall to check the anti-static straps. Now, what a carry-on. It was something completely irrelevant. Nevertheless, it was part of the requirement, and we had to do that. So this can get out of control. But as I said, in software development, there are very few examples of measuring equipment. Now, when we come to do with ISO 9003, the guidance for this, we'll come up with circumstances where this might not be true. Largely to do with either simulation or test equipment, where you're testing performance, for example, or you're testing load. Anything that has an absolute measure is likely to be included in that. So that is section 7 of ISO 9001. As I said before, this is the section where an organization is able to exclude some sections or some requirements on the grounds that they're not relevant. If you want to do that, you're freely able to do so, but you're obliged to say precisely which section have you excluded and on what grounds have you excluded it. And usually it is, well, we don't do that.